Welcome to this installment of supplemental lectures provided by PNC's Concurrent Enrollment Program. My name is Alexandra Kindle, and I will share some information with you that comes out of my History 151 course at Purdue North Central. Americans in the antebellum era were mobile people, and their migrations had real implications for the nation economically and politically. Today we will look at the connection between migration and war. In understanding the antebellum period, it's important to not just think about migration in terms of numbers, but also in terms of motivation. People had to have a reason to leave. And some historians don't like the simplistic method of looking at it in terms of push and pull factors, but some do, and I'm one of those. I've moved a lot over my lifetime, and I find that the idea of push and pull factors works very well. The idea of a push factor means that somebody who is going to move, whether it be across town, across the country, or to another nation, no matter what time period, has to have a reason to leave. There has to be something pushing them. If everything's fine, why move? Then on the other side of it, there has to be something that makes the person decide why they want to go to that place. There has to be something pulling them to that place. So why move across town? Why not move across to the other side of the state or to another nation? And so we can see that in looking at people in the 19th century. There were distinct push and pull factors that made people make choices. Most of the time in the 19th century, the push factors were economic, and it usually had to do with kind of the larger economic situation, but people made individual decisions within that. So in the case of, let's say, the 1830s and 1840s, the economy was changing. There was a depression in 1837. As cities started to emerge, land got more expensive around those cities, and so people found that whatever it was that they were growing or doing wasn't working as well. And so a lot of those people might look to the frontier where there was cheap land. That would be their pull factor. Panics and depressions are definitely a part of the equation and worked as push factors. When people failed economically, when they saw what they would have called hard times or dull times, it made them think about leaving. And the frontier, which was usually in the West, gave them ideas of where to go. That was the place of cheap land. And one writer called the West a geography of hope, because it seemed that there is a place of opportunity beckoning people in times of need. Some people might choose to go to the cities, and that was definitely done. But for today, we're going to be talking about Western migration, so most of these people would have been moving west. A good example of somebody specific in history that has done this comes with the Austen family. Moses Austen was the patriarch of the Austen family, and he had moved his family to Missouri to start. I think they went from Virginia to Missouri, and in Missouri they had a lead mine that failed during the Panic of 1819. His son Stephen decided that Missouri no longer provided what they needed, and he looked to other places. In this case, he looked further south to Texas. The Texas was a Mexican place, and he made an arrangement with the Mexican government that he and some other families could go down to Mexico and live in Mexico's northern territories, one of them being Texas, and they would have referred to it as Tejas. So the Austen family and some others went down there and started farms, and that could have been the end of that history, except of course we know that Texas becomes a big part of our story in the antebellum period. Another part of thinking about migration in the antebellum period has to do with the idea of manifest destiny. The movement west made such an impact that Americans began to imagine it as more than just a migration of people, but one of bringing democracy and virtues to the rest of the continent. Coined by John O'Sullivan in 1845, Democrats, remember that there were two major parties at this point, Democrats and Whigs. Democrats used the term to promote the benefits of migration to obscure the controversy over expanding slavery into the territories. So the two major parties of the antebellum period, of course, were the Whigs and the Democrats. They had very different visions of growth. One, of course, was the The Democrats who really looked to growing the nation by expanding it, by getting more land and sending more Americans out into it. And so you could see with that kind of political ideology, Manifest Destiny would work well with the Democratic platform. The other group was the Whigs, and I'm borrowing these ideas from James McPherson, a well-known historian of the Civil War, but he does a good job in explaining the differences, so I've borrowed this from him. So while the Democrats looked at pushing the nation, growing the nation by pushing out and moving out into new territories, the Whigs looked in at growing the nation more vertically, in the sense of creating a more complex economy. So they were interested in supporting with federal funds things like internal improvements, and also using the federal government to use tariffs and banks to make businesses grow and thus create a stronger economy. So the Whigs ended up distrusting the expansionist ideas of Democrats, while the Democrats distrusted much of the use of the federal government by the Whigs. Very different political ideologies, pretty distinct, and caused a lot of problems prior to the Civil War. John Tyler played a special role in this story. He was a Democrat who joined the Whigs, temporarily winning the vice presidency in 1840 under William Henry Harrison. But after Harrison died, Tyler became president and broke with the Whigs, who then referred to him as His Excellency. In 1843, President Tyler pursued annexation of Texas, much because of the settlement done by the Austin family, as I mentioned earlier. Americans in Texas had declared independence from Mexico in 1836. In secret, Tyler secured a treaty with Sam Houston by 1844. All Tyler needed was congressional approval. In the meantime, 1844 was an election year, and Democrats exploited Manifest Destiny and people's fascination with it, and a stronger political position nationally. Keep in mind that the Whigs were only able to seat 2 presidents in its 20 years as a dominating party. Polk won the election, the Democrat Polk, won the election, but did not take office until March. Tyler, the now lame duck president, played politics, making it very easy for Texas to enter the Union during Polk's term. Both agreed that the United States should expand, and President Polk was not done facilitating U.S. territorial growth. By the mid-1840s, events in Texas and California combined, leading to military conflicts between Mexico and the United States. The loss of the Northern Territory Tejas still stung as more foreigners entered Mexico in places like Alta California between 1841 and 1846. And officials in Mexico worried that once again they would lose a frontier state to the United States. President Polk sent John Slidell to Mexico City for negotiations, but was not received by the Mexican president. When the talks failed, both sides sent troops to the border. The question, however, was which border? Thus, the Texas annexation strained relations between the U.S. and Mexico, especially since the two nations disagreed over the boundaries of the cession. Polk dispatched troops under General Zachary Taylor to the border in January 1846, where Taylor crossed over the Nueces River and approached the Rio Grande. There, General Taylor had a parley with the Mexican commanding officer. Taylor was warned not to cross over the Rio Grande, and Taylor responded, kind of in an American way, the Americans would cross regardless of what the Mexicans did or said. Despite these facts, Polk told the Congress that war exists by the act of Mexico herself. That's a quote. Polk had been looking for trouble and found it. This was not the cause of the war, but an excuse that Polk could use blaming the Mexicans. Polk and his cabinet prepared a declaration of war. Congress, badly divided along political lines, had to support American soldiers under attack, as dramatized by President Polk. Congressmen voted to send supplies and reinforcements, whereupon Polk's Democratic supporters convinced them that they might as well declare war altogether, and Congress did so on May 13, 1846. This war was wholeheartedly supported by Democrats who wished to bring new territory into the United States, while Whig politicians opposed the war but always supported supplying the troops. American forces were generally successful in their campaigns against the Mexicans, but final victory did not come nearly as quickly as Polk had hoped. Taylor and his troops pushed into and seized parts of northeastern Mexico, beginning with the city of Monterrey in September 1846. Monterrey was the most important city in northern Mexico, and the winning of this battle made Taylor a hero. Polk had a difficult time balancing politics and the war. Polk was not going to run for re-election, and by making heroes out of Whig generals, Polk could win the war but lose the election for the Democrats. Taylor's forces needed to move south to Mexico City after that victory, but Polk worried that this would be a hard trek and could make Taylor a powerful rival, which it did, so he started focusing on using Winfield Scott in the hopes to keep Taylor from getting too popular. To this point, Americans elected several war heroes, from Washington to Harrison. So Polk knew what he was doing. In the meantime, Polk ordered other offensives against New Mexico and California. In the summer of 1846, Colonel Stephen W. Kearny made the long trek to Santa Fe before moving on to California, where he joined in on the conflict started by the American settlers and John C. Fremont. Commander Sloat had arrived in July, transforming the Bear Flag revolters into a volunteer American militia fighting for the United States. When Kearny arrived, these forces were now under his command, and by the autumn of 1846, California was basically conquered. The United States now controlled the two territories for which it basically went to war, but Mexican officials were unwilling to end the hostilities or cede the territories. Both Generals Scott and Taylor had more to worry about than just Mexican armies. Camp pollution was the greatest error committed by the United States troops in the Mexican War. The indifference of line officers and recruits to the need for proper sanitation and military hygiene fueled dysentery outbreaks, and the poor conditions in military hospitals contributed further to the spread of disease. Disease caused an enormous drain on the United States Army's resources, eroded troop morale, and influenced strategy and tactics. Some of this had to do with how the American people viewed the role of the Army in the new republic. Americans disdained the idea of having a big standing army as the Europeans had, and so the body of this army was supported by a backbone of well-trained West Point graduates, including Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee. The Army struggled to recruit volunteers, but these were men not used to the discipline of military life and the basic rules of camp construction. Disease caused by incompetence, virus, philandering soldiers, and mysterious causes took more lives than battle. Yellow fever, diarrhea, dysentery, and typhoid claimed lives amid the poor sanitation of the camps. Other diseases such as measles, smallpox, mumps, syphilis, gonorrhea, and cholera claimed lives in lesser numbers. In totaling all deaths among American soldiers in the Mexican-American War, 1,192 were killed in action, 529 died of wounds received in battle, 362 suffered accidental death. Contrast that with the deaths from disease, 11,155. Disease claimed a toll 7 times greater than that of Mexican weapons. The Americans in undertaking this war were lucky for many reasons, one being that the Mexican army was so unprepared for the fight. In some areas they still used lances, and their horses seemed half-starved to Americans. By chance, the troops were able to escape the yellow fever season. This could have decimated the army at the end of the war, just when it was time to end the war. Well-trained officers and a lot of good luck balanced out the politically controlled army racked by disease. These were all good lessons for military men and politicians about how to pursue war even if they did not know the Civil War was coming. Despite the problems, those West Point grads practiced fighting and commanding. They also learned each other's strengths and weaknesses. A good example of how this played out in the Civil War was Lee was able to predict that Grant would retrench at Spotsylvania after the Battle of the Wilderness. Just a little side point. While the Mexican War demonstrated Polk's commitment to taking a large amount of territory by war, this was not the case with Oregon. One of Polk's campaign slogans had been 54-40 or fight, but in 1846, Polk's agents helped to settle the Oregon question with a compromise between the United States and Great Britain at the 49-degree line. They used a treaty and not war. The Mexican War ended with the signing and ratification of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in February 1848. Mexican politics had been a mess since it had broken away from Spain, and would continue to be so until well after the Civil War. Governments toppled and emerged, but by February 1848, the two sides were able to rough out a treaty. Mexico ceded 55% of its territory, and the United States compensated Mexico with $15 million for war-related damage. The United States gained a large amount of territory that officially excluded slavery, but now was open to expansion. Southern Democrats argued that the treaty transferred too little territory and called for new negotiations. The Whigs, who had opposed the war in words but funded it nonetheless, worked to ratify the February treaty negotiated by Nicholas Trist. Bringing in Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, and California was bad enough, but if the Democrats kept going, where would they stop? Indeed, the Democrats wanted to keep expanding into Mexico, Canada, and Cuba. These places were not annexed, yet the events of the 1840s completed the basic outlines of the goals of Manifest Destiny. Here's a map of the nation in 1830. Now compare that to 1860. Antebellum Americans were mobile, and they were the agents of Manifest Destiny. The politicians of the period just did the paperwork. The Mexican War caused more problems than it solved. Politicians were divided over the war, with Democrats supporting it while Whigs did not. It also raised sectional questions. Many Northerners were sure that Mr. Polk's war was designed to bring new lands to slave owners, which meant more economic and political power for the South. As sectional tensions rose, the balance between slave and free states meant more senatorial power for one region in the increasingly adversarial Congress. It is important to consider that Polk campaigned about Oregon with aggressive rhetoric, but was really only willing to fight to bring Mexico into the Union. There were also new western lands coming into the Union, and California's application for statehood after the war caused a firestorm and led congressmen to try and solve the problems with one more compromise. Of course, there had already been one in 1820, and now the Compromise of 1850 brought the United States a western free state and the idea of popular sovereignty for Utah and New Mexico territories. These western lands would not be of major significance in the story of the coming war, but that idea of popular sovereignty was applied to Kansas with disastrous results for Kansans and Americans. So the Mexican War must be considered as a significant event. In this case, we focused on land acquisition, but repercussions rippled out from this war in many directions. Hopefully you'll be able to examine those with your instructor. Thank you for joining me today. I hope that this information will help you in your studies. We all hope to see you at PNC when you are done with your high school degree.